Suffering with dignity may seem like an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. How can we suffer and at the same time maintain our dignity? However, this is exactly what Viktor Frankl, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, teaches us. For him, suffering with dignity is not only a possibility, but a necessity in order to find meaning and purpose in our lives. To better understand this, it is important to define what it means to suffer with dignity. Suffering with dignity does not mean that we do not feel pain, that we do not feel hurt or wounded. It does mean that we are aware that pain is an inevitable part of life and that we choose how we respond to it. It is choosing between surrendering to pain and becoming a victim, or rising above it and finding a greater purpose. Suffering with dignity also doesn't mean we don't show our emotions. On the contrary, it means we are willing to confront our feelings, accept our fragility, and allow ourselves to be vulnerable. This isn't easy, because our society teaches us to hide our emotions, to be strong, and to never show our weaknesses. However, it is precisely this vulnerability that allows us to connect with ourselves and others on a deeper level. Furthermore, suffering with dignity means that we are willing to find meaning in our pain. This does not mean that the pain is justified or necessary, but rather that we can find a reason for why it occurred. This could be personal growth, a change in perspective, or the discovery of a new passion. When we find meaning in our pain, we can turn it into something positive, something that makes us grow and stronger. Suffering with dignity is not just a way of coping with pain, but a choice we make in every moment. It is choosing between surrendering to pain and becoming a victim, or rising above it and finding a greater purpose. It is a choice that requires courage, self-awareness, and a willingness to confront our feelings and our weaknesses. However, it is only when we make this choice that we can truly find meaning and purpose in our lives. When we think of suffering, the first thing that comes to mind is the idea that we need to overcome it, get past it, or even prevent it from happening. However, Viktor Frankl, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, teaches us that suffering can be an opportunity to find a greater purpose in our lives. According to him, the search for meaning in the midst of suffering is the path to finding dignity in the midst of pain. Frankl, who endured extreme experiences in Nazi concentration camps, knew all too well what it was like to suffer. But instead of giving in to despair, he found a way to transform his pain into something more. He realized that even in the most adverse conditions, people have the ability to find purpose, a meaning that gives them the strength to move forward. And it is precisely this search for meaning that allows us to suffer with dignity. When we are going through a difficult time, it is easy to feel lost and directionless. But according to Frankl, it is precisely at these times that we need to turn inward and find what really matters to us. We need to ask ourselves, what am I searching for? What do I want to achieve? What is the purpose I want to fulfill? It is this search for meaning that allows us to find meaning in suffering, and not just suffer for the sake of suffering. Furthermore, Frankl also highlights the importance of not focusing solely on the pursuit of happiness or pleasure. According to him, happiness is a side effect of life, not the main goal. What really matters is finding a purpose that gives us meaning, even in the midst of suffering. And it is precisely this search for meaning that allows us to find dignity in the midst of pain. Finally, it is important to remember that the search for meaning is not an easy process. It requires courage, perseverance, and determination. But according to Frankl, it is precisely this struggle that allows us to find true dignity. When we suffer with dignity, we are no longer just suffering, we are living. We are living with purpose, with meaning, and with a reason to move forward, even in the midst of pain. When we think about suffering with dignity, we inevitably come to the question of purpose. You may be wondering, what does this have to do with suffering with dignity? The answer is everything. You see, when we are going through a time of suffering, whether it be physical, emotional, or spiritual, it is easy to feel lost and directionless. This is when purpose becomes more important than ever. Purpose is what gives us direction. It's what makes us get up every day and face the challenges that life presents us. When you have a clear purpose, you know exactly what you're fighting for and what you're trying to achieve. It gives you strength, it gives you courage, and it gives you the ability to overcome any obstacle. And it's exactly this strength, courage, and ability that Viktor Frankl wanted you to have when he talked about suffering with dignity. But how do you find your purpose? That's the million-dollar question. For Frankl, purpose is not something you find, it's something you create. It's something you build from your experiences, values, and beliefs. It's something you develop over time through reflection, self-knowledge, and introspection. And it's precisely this building of purpose that allows you to find meaning in your suffering. When you have a clear purpose, you can find meaning in any situation, even the most difficult ones. You can find a greater meaning in your suffering, a meaning that goes beyond the pain and discomfort. You can find a greater purpose in your life, a purpose that allows you to overcome any obstacle and achieve your goals. But purpose isn't just important in times of suffering, it's important in every moment of life. It's what makes us feel fulfilled, happy, and complete. It's what makes us feel like we're doing something worthwhile. And it's exactly this sense of fulfillment, happiness, and fulfillment that Viktor Frankl wanted you to experience when you suffer with dignity. In short, purpose is the key to suffering with dignity. It is the key to finding meaning in your suffering, to overcoming obstacles and achieving your goals. It is the key to feeling fulfilled, happy and complete, even in moments of pain and discomfort. And this is exactly the key that Viktor Frankl wanted you to find on your journey to suffering with dignity. Imagine yourself in a place where human dignity was stripped away, where hope seemed to lose its meaning, and where death was an everyday reality. This place was the Auschwitz concentration camp, one of the most notorious Nazi concentration camps during World War II. It was here that Viktor Frankl, a young Austrian psychiatrist, was interned in 1944, along with his wife and parents. Yet, even in the midst of such horror, Frankl found a way to maintain his dignity. He realized that while the Nazis could control his body and mind, they could not control his attitude toward the conditions he found himself in. He chose not to give in to despair and despondency, and instead, he resolved to find a greater purpose in his life, even in the midst of such inhumane circumstances. Frankl observed that in Auschwitz, prisoners were divided into three groups: those who became brutal and aggressive, those who became submissive and resigned, and those who found a way to maintain their humanity. He himself chose the latter option, deciding to focus on helping other prisoners, sharing what little food he had, offering words of comfort and moral support. In an environment where solidarity was seen as a threat to the Nazi regime, Frankl found a way to exercise his compassion and empathy. Frankl also found a way to keep his mind active and his intellectual curiosity alive. In his memoirs, he recounts that even amid the precarious conditions of the concentration camp, he continued to develop his theories on logotherapy, a psychological approach that focuses on the meaning and purpose of life. He wrote down his ideas on scraps of paper, which would later become the book Man's Search for Meaning, one of the most important works on the Holocaust. In Auschwitz, Frankl also found a way to maintain his spirituality. Although he himself was not religious, he saw how faith helped many prisoners maintain their dignity and hope. He noticed that even in the midst of such horror, religious prisoners found a way to pray, sing hymns, and celebrate their traditions. Frankl realized that even if religion was not their own choice, it could be a source of comfort and strength for many people. In short, Viktor Frankl's example at Auschwitz is a testament to the human capacity to maintain dignity under extreme conditions. He chose not to give in to despair and despondency, and instead found a way to maintain his humanity, his compassion, his intellectual curiosity, and his spirituality. His example inspires us to reflect on our own capacity to maintain our dignity in difficult times and to find a greater purpose in our lives, even in the midst of adversity. The choice between reacting with despair or finding meaning is a crossroads that we all face at some point in our lives. It is when adversity knocks on our door and presents us with a challenge: will we give in to despair or will we find a reason to keep going? Viktor Frankl, the father of logotherapy, knew this choice all too well. He himself went through horrific experiences in the Nazi concentration camps, where he witnessed the destruction of humanity. Yet it was precisely in this environment of horror that he discovered the power of meaning. For Frankl, meaning is not something we find, but something we create. Even in the midst of suffering, we can choose how we respond. We can choose to give in to despair, or we can search for a purpose that gives us the strength to carry on. This does not mean that suffering disappears, but rather that it becomes more bearable, and it is precisely this choice that allows us to maintain our dignity even in the face of adversity. When we choose to react in despair, we are surrendering to our circumstances. We are allowing our suffering to define us, but when we choose to find meaning, we are taking back control. We are saying, yes, I am suffering, but that does not define me. I am more than that. It is a choice that requires courage. It is true. It is easier to surrender to despair than to fight to find purpose. But it is precisely this fight that makes us stronger, more resilient. Frankl tells a story about a prisoner who had lost everything: his family, his home, his freedom. However, he found purpose in helping other prisoners, in being a shoulder to cry on in a place of so much suffering. And it was precisely this choice that gave him the strength to move forward. He was no longer giving in to despair, but rather finding meaning in the midst of suffering. This choice is not unique to concentration camps, of course. It applies to our everyday lives. When we face illness, loss, or unemployment, we have a choice about how we respond. We can give in to despair, or we can find meaning. We can find a purpose that gives us the strength to carry on. And it is precisely this choice that allows us to maintain our dignity even in the face of adversity. So the next time adversity knocks on our door, let us remember that we have a choice to make. We can react with despair, or we can find meaning. We can surrender to the circumstance, or we can take back control. And it is precisely this choice that will allow us to maintain dignity even in the face of suffering. When we think of suffering, our minds naturally turn to the idea that it is something to be avoided at all costs. And in a way, this is understandable. No one likes to feel uncomfortable, to feel powerless, or to feel like they are losing control. However, Viktor Frankl teaches us that suffering is not just an unpleasant experience, but also an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to develop as human beings. And this all starts with the attitude we adopt towards suffering. You can choose how you respond to suffering. You can surrender to your emotions, indulge in self-compassion, and allow yourself to be consumed by pain. Or you can choose to face suffering head-on with courage and dignity. It is this choice that makes all the difference. When you choose to face suffering, you begin to feel stronger, more resilient, and more capable of dealing with life's difficult circumstances. But how do we do this? How can we develop this attitude towards suffering? Well, it's important to remember that attitude is not something you either have or don't have. It's something you can develop, something you can train, and something you can improve over time and with practice. And one of the most effective ways to do this is by focusing on the present. Instead of worrying about the future or lamenting the past, you can choose to focus on the present, on what you can control and what you can do to improve your situation. Additionally, it's crucial to remember that suffering is not a reflection of our identity. You are not your suffering. You are so much more than the difficult circumstances you are facing. And when you remember this, you begin to feel freer, lighter, and more capable of dealing with suffering. You begin to feel like you are in control of your life, rather than being controlled by your emotions. And finally, it's important to remember that suffering is not an end in itself. It's an opportunity for you to connect with others, to feel part of something bigger than yourself, and to find a greater purpose in your life. When you feel connected to others, you begin to feel less alone, less isolated, and less lost. You begin to feel like you're walking alongside people who understand what you're going through and who are willing to help you carry your burden. In short, your attitude towards suffering is what makes all the difference. You can choose to surrender to suffering or face it head-on, with courage and dignity. You can choose to focus on the present. Remember that you are not your suffering and connect with others. And when you do this, you begin to feel stronger, more resilient, and better able to deal with life's difficult circumstances. When we think of suffering, our minds automatically turn to pain, loss, and lack. However, Viktor Frankl teaches us that suffering can be more than just a negative experience. It can be an opportunity for growth, a chance to become stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Imagine that you are going through a difficult experience, whether it is a personal loss, a professional challenge, or an illness. It is easy to feel victimized by the situation and ask yourself, why is this happening to me? However, Frankl encourages us to shift our perspective and ask, why is this happening to me? In other words, what can you learn from this experience? What is the greater purpose behind the pain? When we're suffering, it's easy to focus on what's missing, on what we no longer have. However, Frankl reminds us that suffering can also be an opportunity to discover what we still have. What do you value most in your life? What are the things that give you meaning and purpose? Suffering can be an opportunity to rediscover these things and reevaluate what's truly important. Furthermore, suffering can be an opportunity to develop one of the most important human virtues, resilience. When we go through difficult experiences, we have two choices. We can either surrender to pain and hopelessness, or we can choose to rise again, stronger and wiser. Resilience is not just a natural ability. It is a skill that can be developed and honed with practice and determination. Finally, suffering can be an opportunity to connect with others. When we are suffering, it is easy to feel isolated and alone. However, the truth is that suffering is a universal experience. We all suffer at some point in our lives, and it is precisely in these moments that we can choose to connect with others who are also suffering. We can choose to open up, to share our pain and vulnerability, and to find support and compassion in others. So suffering is not just a negative experience. It is an opportunity for growth, development, and connection. It is an opportunity to become stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And it is precisely in this moment that we can choose to rise again, stronger and more enlightened than ever before. When we think of suffering with dignity, we automatically think of accepting what we cannot change and focusing on what we can control. And it is precisely at this point that Viktor Frankl teaches us a valuable lesson. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl recounts his experience in Nazi concentration camps during World War II, where he and other prisoners were subjected to inhumane conditions of hunger, cold, and forced labor. However, despite all the adversities, Frankl discovered that there was one thing he could still control: his attitude. Rather than giving in to despair and despondency, Frankl chose to focus on finding meaning in his suffering. He began to notice the small moments of beauty that still existed in the midst of the misery, such as the sunlight shining through the bars of his cell, or the kindness of a prisoner sharing his meager food with others. In doing so, Frankl discovered that even in the midst of chaos and suffering, he still had the power to choose how he responded to his circumstances. This is a powerful lesson for us, because we often feel powerless in the face of life's challenges. We think we can't control what's happening around us, and that we are the playthings of fate. However, Frankl shows us that this is not true. Even when we can't control our circumstances, we can control our attitude toward them. And it is precisely this attitude that can make all the difference between victory and defeat. When we focus on what we can control, we begin to see that we are not at the mercy of our circumstances. Instead, we become the captains of our own lives, choosing how to respond to the things that happen to us. And this is what allows us to grieve with dignity, even when things seem impossible. By focusing on what we can control, we are choosing not only how to respond to circumstances, but also how to grow and learn from them. Furthermore, when we focus on what we can control, we begin to see that many of the things we worry about are actually out of our control. This may sound strange, but it is a liberating truth. When we recognize that we cannot control everything, we can begin to let go of the burden of having to control everything. This allows us to live more lightly, more peacefully, and more focused on what really matters. So the next time you find yourself facing a challenge, remember that you have the power to choose how you respond. Focus on what you can control, and don't worry about what you can't. That's how you can grieve with dignity and find meaning in your suffering, even in the most difficult moments. When we think of suffering, we automatically associate it with the idea of pain, loss, and despair. However, Viktor Frankl, the father of logotherapy, teaches us that suffering can be transformed into something deeper, more meaningful. And this is where the idea of letting suffering make you stronger comes into play. Did you know that suffering can be an opportunity for growth? Yes, you read that right. Suffering can be a catalyst for you to discover who you really are, what you are capable of enduring, and what you can overcome. It is as if suffering were a mirror that reflects our soul, showing us our weaknesses and our strength. And it is precisely in this reflection that we can find the opportunity to change, to grow, and to become stronger. One of the main challenges we face when we are suffering is the loss of control. We feel powerless, as if fate has abandoned us. However, it is precisely at this moment that we can exercise control over our attitude. We can choose how we will react to suffering, how we will deal with pain, and how we will find a way to move forward. And it is this choice that can make us stronger, more resilient, and wiser. Furthermore, suffering can teach us the art of patience. When we are going through a difficult time, we have to learn to wait, to hope, to trust that things will get better. And it is precisely in this waiting that we can find the opportunity to reflect, to meditate, and to connect with our values and our goals. It is in this patience that we can find the strength to move forward even when all seems lost. And finally, suffering can teach us the importance of gratitude. When we are going through a difficult time, it is easy to focus on what is missing, on what we do not have. However, it is precisely at this time that we must focus on what we do have, on what remains. And it is this gratitude that can give us the strength to move forward, to find a way to overcome the pain and to find peace. So it is possible to let suffering make you stronger. It is possible to transform pain into something deeper, more meaningful. It is possible to find strength in weakness, light in darkness, and hope in despair. You just have to choose how you will react to suffering, how you will deal with pain, and how you will find a way forward. Freedom of choice in the midst of suffering is a revolutionary concept that Viktor Frankl presents in his logotherapeutic theory. In the midst of pain and adversity, it is easy to feel trapped in a trap of hopelessness and helplessness. However, Frankl shows us that even in extreme situations, there is always a choice to be made. This choice is not about changing external circumstances, but about how we respond to them. It is about finding deeper meaning and significance in our experience, even when it is painful. It is about choosing how we will deal with suffering, rather than allowing it to define us. Frankl illustrates this idea with his own example during World War II. When he was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, he had no choice about his living conditions, but he did choose how to respond to them. Instead of giving in to hopelessness and despondency, he chose to seek deeper meaning in his experience. He chose to focus on what he could still control, such as his attitude and his response to circumstances. This choice may seem insignificant compared to the magnitude of suffering, but it is precisely this choice that can give us the strength and courage to move forward. It is the choice to not let suffering rob us of our dignity and our humanity. It is the choice to find a purpose higher than our own pain. Furthermore, freedom of choice in the midst of suffering also allows us to redefine what it means to suffer. Instead of seeing suffering as a negative and destructive experience, we can see it as an opportunity to grow and develop. We can choose to see suffering as a chance to find deeper meaning and significance in our lives. This perspective may seem counterintuitive, but it is precisely this perspective that can give us the strength to move forward, even in the midst of pain and adversity. It is the choice to find meaning higher than our own pain, and it is this choice that can give us the dignity we speak of. And now, faced with suffering, you have a choice. You can let it consume you, or you can use this opportunity to find meaning, purpose, and growth. Viktor Frankl showed that even in the midst of the hell of Auschwitz, it is possible to find dignity and meaning. You can't control your circumstances, but you can control your attitude toward them. You can choose to react with despair or find meaning in the midst of pain. You can let yourself be discouraged or use suffering as an opportunity for growth. Suffering with dignity is not about being indifferent to suffering. It is about finding strength in adversity. It is about using suffering to become stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. It is about finding freedom in the midst of suffering, choosing how to react and how to behave. So in the face of suffering, remember that you have the power to choose. Choose to find meaning, choose to find purpose, choose to become stronger, suffer with dignity, and discover that even in the darkness, there is a light that shines brighter. Thank you for watching this far. If you were inspired by Viktor Frankl's story and would like to learn more about finding meaning and purpose in the midst of suffering, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Also, share your own stories of overcoming and how you deal with life's challenges in the comments below. Let's create a community that supports and inspires each other. Let's continue this journey of self-knowledge and growth together. Thanks again for watching.